Our topic today is legal issues of gender identity, and we'd like to highlight 3 related projects that FFRPL and the library are actively involved in at this time. The library is working with the Out Alliance to transfer dozens of special LGBTQ collections to RPL's Local History and Genealogy Division. The library, FFRPL, and the Out Alliance are also partnering with Image Out and other local organizations to present the Rainbow Dialogues, an all-day program based upon those special LGBTQ collections on Saturday, March 24th at Central Library. Franklin Robinson, an archivist from the Smithsonian with a specialty in LGBTQ materials, will be the special guest. An archival recognition dinner at the Memorial Art Gallery will follow later that night. FFRPL has also recently worked with a local couple to create a new equality fund for humanity and enlightenment in pursuit of a world free of discrimination. In a piece written for It Gets Better, former President Barack Obama wrote, "As a nation, we're founded on the belief that all of us are equal, and each of us deserves the freedom to pursue our own version of happiness, to make the most of our talents, to speak our minds, to not fit in, most of all, to be true to ourselves. That's the freedom that enriches all of us. That's what America is all about." That might have been the original vision, but the striking reality is that 2017 was the deadliest year on record for transgender people in the United States, according to the Human Rights Campaign. Our guest speaker today is gender identity expert Rowan Collins, who currently serves as the communications manager for the Out Alliance. Rowan received his bachelor's in psychology and women and gender studies from Nazareth College. He has traveled extensively, leading workshops and trainings pertaining to LGBTQ inclusion, and has facilitated trainings for more than 50 K-12 public schools and 43 colleges and universities in 14 states. Please join me in welcoming Rowan Collins.
All right. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. Just gonna bear with me for a second while I actually open my presentation up. There we go. Simple enough. There we are. Okay, so legal issues of gender identity. So we have a pretty large task here because we have about 35 minutes, and we're gonna run through all of it. So my name is Rowan Collins. I am the communications manager for the Out Alliance. Prior to about 2 months ago, I was the education coordinator for the past 3 years. Like Susan mentioned, I have done probably upwards of 400 presentations to about 15,000 people over the last couple of years around issues related to the LGBTQ community. So I'm really excited to be here with you folks this afternoon. I thank you very much for taking your time from such a really kind of wonderful day. The sun was actually out somehow earlier, and so I really appreciate you folks being here. I'll give you just a little breakdown of what we're actually going to get into, while knowing that we will have that portion for Q&A towards the end. So it's a bit of a daunting task to talk about legal issues pertaining to gender identity when lots of folks might not even know what gender identity even encapsulates. What does it mean when we actually say that? So what I'm going to do is actually break down some of the terms related to the LGBT community when it comes to gender, just so we have a brief overview before I really kind of jump in and show us what the legal landscape looks like. Susan mentioned earlier that 2017 was the deadliest year on record for the transgender community in the United States. They also said that about 2016, and they said that about 2015, and they said that about 2014. As of yesterday, 4 trans people have already been murdered in this country, and that's only the folks that we know of. Lots of people are intentionally misgendered, either by law enforcement or by news reporting, so we don't even find out about lots of those folks. Many of these people may be coming from families that aren't accepting of their identity, and so we'll never know, because that family then has the power to say, well, we won't discuss this ever again. A really unfortunate piece of it is that one of the people who we lost last week was actually in Buffalo. So it brings these things closer to home. We did lose someone in the Rochester area in Gates back in September. According to Mike.com, the average, to start something, the average rate of murder in the U.S. general population is about 1 in 19,000. Okay, so that doesn't sound great already. For young adults, it's 1 in 12,000. And for transgender black women, it is 1 in 2,500. So we are looking at a culture of violence, a culture of discrimination, and some of that can come out in physical violence, but a lot of it comes out in systemic discrimination, and that's really what we're going to talk about today. Because, one-on-one violence is what ends up often taking people's lives, but some of this systemic discrimination is what helps it get there. So we're going to talk about what the legal landscape actually looks like for folks within the transgender community specifically throughout our country, but also recognizing that lots of these issues impact folks within the LGBT community who aren't trans as well. So to start, what I'm going to do is I'm going to very quickly lay out some of the concepts within gender. We talk about gender identity or we talk about biological sex, and oftentimes we confuse the two terms together. Or we think that transgender and gay might be the same thing. And that makes sense because we never get taught that these things might be separate, that sex and gender and orientation lie in different places. So we're going to be looking through some of these components of our identity. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. There is a handout that has exactly what I'm going to say on that back table, so if you want to take that with you for reference, please, I would encourage you to do so. So the first thing that we're really going to talk about quickly is understanding biological sex. Now, we talk about sex and gender interchangeably in our society. We think of them almost as the same thing for the most part, right? Say same-sex couples, things like that, when often we're actually talking about same-gender couples. So understanding that biological sex is our actual biology, much of which we're born with, some of which will develop as we grow, right? Go through puberty, all sorts of things as we're aging. So this can be our hormones, our chromosomes, our reproductive organs, things like that, right? A lot of which is within our physical body. Now, the flip side of that is gender. Now, that second term being gender identity, okay? So our gender identity is how we know ourselves to be in a gendered way. And for some folks, that does not align with the sex that they were assigned at birth, with the body that they were born with the way that their chromosomes or their hormones have laid out kind of that path for them, right? So if we can understand biological sex and gender as two separate things, then we can have conversations around the transgender community. Because where trans folks find that identity is in the incongruence between gender identity and biological sex. Right? Saying who I know myself to be in my own mind is different from what I'm been told based on my body, based on what people expected of me when I was born. Right? Now, the vast majority of people will find that the gender identity that they have fits the body they were born with. Right? Let's say, when you were born and the doctor said it's a boy or it's a girl, and growing up, that's fit for you. Maybe you've never even questioned it until right now when I brought it up. It just kind of worked. You're like, yeah, I'm good. If you were 3 or 4 years old and someone asked you, are you a boy or are you a girl? You had that answer. It was very clear and there was never any question about it. That's the vast majority of the world. Probably somewhere around 98, 99% of the world would probably fall into that category. I'm actually going to throw a question out to the audience early. Does anyone know the term for someone who is not transgender? I'm hearing whispers. It sounds like cisgender. Wonderful. Thank you. It started to sound like snake. I don't know where we were going. Okay, so cisgender. Yes. So the term being cisgender, for those of us who may be a little newer to that term, CIS gender, all one word. Okay. Essentially, the state of not being transgender. Right. So this would be an individual who feels as though their gender identity and their biological sex are in congruence with each other. Right. That that assumption of this is your gender based on the body that you have, that works. And it works for the vast majority of people. Now, this may be a new word for some of us, and that's totally okay. It's not a word you have to take on for yourself. Introduce yourself to the next person you meet. Hi, I'm cisgender. So nice to meet you. Isn't it a wonderful day we're having? Obviously, that is completely up to you, but it's a really good term for all of us to have in our wheelhouse because it's a way for us to talk about the majority without further marginalizing a minority. Right? Before we had the term cisgender, we said things like normal people. Right? Well, you got your trans people, and then you've got your normal people. Right? Thank heavens. That doesn't make anyone feel very good about themselves, and it helps to further a society of discrimination. Right? It separates us. It makes it seem like one is better than the other instead of just two different things. Right? So understanding that difference between biological sex and gender identity, that for lots of folks they're congruent, but that doesn't mean that they are in one. for folks in the transgender community, for the most part, that biological sex and gender identity thing is just not matching. That's where a lot of that internal angst, that confusion can come from, because we're told, well, this is who you are, so why aren't you fitting well? Well, I'm not fitting, so what does this mean for me? Okay? One other term that I do want to touch on is gender expression. Okay? So gender expression is how we express who we know ourselves to be to the rest of the world. If we want to think about gender identity as kind of like in between our ears, it's in our minds, right? Our psychological sense of self. Well, how do we communicate that to the rest of the world? Right? It's through our gender expression. Our gender expression is a lot of things. It is our hair, it is our clothing, it's our shoes, makeup and jewelry if we wear it. It's the way that we walk, the way that we talk, how we hold ourselves, the pitch of our voice, the activities that we get into, sports we play, instruments we play, what we major in college, what we have jobs in. Lots of these things are gender expression. A lot of it is how we get socialized early on in life, right? Who we're told to play with, what toys we're allowed to play with, how we're told to dress. Are we allowed to have short hair or long hair? Can we explore what works for us? Now, a lot of times when we are actually seeing issues around the trans community and around gender identity, folks are actually being targeted for their gender expression. Okay? It's not actually, I don't appreciate how you're identifying your gender, it's I don't like how you're expressing it to the rest of the world. Something about the way you're expressing yourself doesn't fit well in my expectation. So understanding that expression and identity piece being somewhat separate from each other. Right? Lots of times it'll make sense, right? The way that someone expresses their gender is a way for them to communicate how they identify. Right? But we don't always know from looking, right? We make those snap judgments. We stare at people and we try and say, all right, this person has long hair, that person's wearing glasses, they're wearing a certain kind of clothing. Got it, right? I can fill in all those blanks. I know who they are. So if we're looking and we're expecting that we filled in all the blanks, but maybe we're wrong about one of the blanks, people get very upset about that, right? What I'm expecting is not there. I don't know what to do now. And often that can trigger these emotions of rage, of distrust, of fear even. So understanding some of that expression piece is really where some of those legal the actual violence can stem from. Now, gender expression will come up again in just a few minutes when I talk about some of those legal issues out there. Oftentimes we have policies, we have laws, we have bills that are passed protecting folks based on sexual orientation or based on gender identity, but we don't actually talk about gender expression all that often. And so we're actually end up doing folks a disservice, because it's not just about how you identify your gender, it's about how you express that and how people take that and what they can do for that. So I'm going to jump now into talking about some of those actual legal protections, where we stand as a country, and also focusing in on New York State. It's a little more important for us here as we live in New York. Now, blow through a couple of these. There we go. All right. So we're talking about rights for LGBTQ people, and all of those slides that I just blew through are on that handout, talking a little bit more about orientation, understanding those as separate components within our identity. But we do want to spend a little time talking about what does it look like for folks within the LGBTQ community in our country. It's actually really hard to focus specifically on trans people because there's not a lot of research being done on the trans community in our country, right? And it starts to become a cyclical issue because if you don't have a research base, it's really hard to apply to get funding to continue it. If you don't have funding, you can't start research in the first place. And so we just kind of spin on and on with not a lot to go on, right? For a lot of folks, they are not counted in the census, right? It's not a question. No one's identity within the LGBTQ plus community is in the census, so we actually have no idea, right? We have no rough estimate, really, of how many folks might actually be in these communities. And so it's really hard to provide the right kind of programming, to provide the right sort of accommodations when we don't even know how many people could be reached or are in need. And so again, we look at these cyclical issues. So a little bit off there, but one of the projects that exists in this country that looks at mapping out the protections or lack of protections for LGBTQ people is called MAP. It's the Movement Advancement Project, and it can be found at lgbtmap.org. Really, really wonderful site. It breaks down every single issue of discrimination that you could ever think of by state and by policy. So you'll know exactly what each state has in terms of marriage protections, adoption, conversion therapy, employment discrimination, public accommodation discrimination, the works. So, a little tough to see here on this map, but this is kind of the picture of the whole country right now. And so I'll kind of jump in and give you a little bit of a hint. So, the top one right there, which looks like a very wonderful dark beige, is actually green, and that is our high overall policy tally. So there are 14 states in this country that are considered to have a high policy tally. That means that there is a lot of protection for LGBT people in those states. So 14 states and the District of Columbia. Okay. 8 states have like a medium overall policy tally, which means like, yeah, they're doing okay. Some things they may have more on, others not. The nice thing about the MAP project is they actually make a difference between protections for LGB folks and protections for trans folks, because those are very different, right? One, we're looking at, for the most part, orientation. For one, for the most part, we're looking at identity within gender. But 28 states overall have very low policy tallies, which means that lots of places in this country have absolutely no protections or have bans on introducing protections. Those are those 5 at the bottom, the negative overall policy tallies. Those are the states that have actually put in place legal barriers to even introducing non-discrimination ordinances. They just can't happen unless it's an entirely new House and legislature and all that who actually overdoes things. Sure. So our negative overall policy tally states are Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, South Dakota, and Nebraska. Okay? So that may not be surprising to some of us if we have been following any other politics around those areas or just have an understanding of some of the climates in some of those states. So when we're looking at kind of the low overall policy tally, it is kind of the strange burnt sienna color that we're dealing with for the most part there. And as you see, lots of the places on the coasts are the ones that have the higher policy tallies. Now, that's for a lot of different reasons, but it also means that the vast majority of folks in this country are kind of left in the dark, right? Too bad if you don't live in New York or California, right? Well, some people don't live in New York or California. We're lucky too, but lots of people don't. And so that means that there are lots of folks out there, millions of people, who are living in states that either have absolutely nothing to address discrimination for their community or are actively seeking to block non-discrimination. 51% of LGBT adults live in states with hostile laws and little legal protection. Okay? So when we talk about discrimination based in public accommodation, now this is really key. Okay? This is usually the last thing to get put in place. We'll have employment discrimination, we'll have housing discrimination laws, sometimes there's a hate crime law, maybe. Public accommodation is usually the last thing that gets actually talked about, and it's sometimes the most important. Because what is public accommodation? Everything but your house is public accommodation, technically speaking, unless you are actually on private property. If you are in the public library, you are in a public accommodation, right? Regardless of whether you're using the restroom or not, but restrooms, absolutely, right? Restaurants, hotels, movie theaters, the bus, right? Almost everything except for your private property, your house, the rental place that you're in, and certain spaces is technically public accommodation. So if folks aren't allowed to exist in public accommodation, we have a huge problem, right? People can't be civically engaged if they are not allowed to just exist where they need to be without fear of harassment, without violence, without actual policy ejection. So only 19 states and D.C., not to belittle them, they're just technically not a state, 19 states and D.C. prohibit discrimination in public accommodations based on orientation and gender identity. There are 2 states that only protect against discrimination in public accommodation based on orientation. They don't include gender identity. There's only 2 of them so far. Just take a look at the map again, okay? So our 19 states are the darker ones. So again, most of the Northeast, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Colorado, New Mexico, and then the West Coast, including Nevada. These are places where there are public accommodation non-discrimination laws that cover orientation and gender identity, which means that you cannot be asked to leave a place of public accommodation simply based on your identity. You can be asked to leave if you're like making a ruckus and nobody wants you there, right? There's legal ramifications, but you cannot just be asked because someone doesn't like the way that you look, right? Or doesn't like the fact that you're holding your partner's hand, right? That is not legal in those 19 states in DC. However, there are 29 states where there's nothing, absolutely nothing. So there's no protection, right? If someone in the library says, you're making me really uncomfortable, I'm going to have to ask you to leave, and you don't feel like you have any way to argue that back, then there's nothing, right? You can't call up your local ACLU and say, hey, someone kicked me out of the library because they didn't like the dress I was wearing today. It's a hard case to make. And the really upsetting thing is that there are 3 states that have laws preventing the passage of non-discrimination laws based on public accommodation. So, and they have the warning sign. Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina currently have legislation in place blocking the passage of further non-discrimination laws. So in these places, people are actually actively trying to make sure that non-discrimination ordinances cannot be actually passed. Okay? So again, we're seeing that there's this climate, right, of people who essentially are not safe to leave their homes, right? If you don't have public accommodation non-discrimination ordinances in place, I guarantee you don't have employment or housing non-discrimination ordinances in place, right? That means that folks are having trouble holding jobs, right? Because someone can look at you and say, I don't like how you're expressing your gender. I'm going to have to pass, right? Or, they can make up another excuse and say, well, you're just not appropriate for the workplace and you're going to have to go. And you have no legal recourse in those places to say, I was fired unjustly based on my identity. The vast majority of the states in the country is still true for trans folks. They have no legal recourse to say, they fired me because I'm trans, and that's not okay. Still about 30 states in this country, that's legal. There's no recourse in that matter, especially in the private sector. Okay? So just to give another really, really brief overview here before we just talk about New York for just a few minutes and I turn it over for questions. Basically, if you want to look at it, take a look at this wheel here on the right side. Now, we would say about a quarter have that high equality tally that we talked about, right? So there's a lot of protections for LGBT folks, both in orientation and gender identity, about a quarter of people there. We have just a few medium equality states, another few low equality states, and then all of those folks are considered negative equality states. Okay, so they either have absolutely nothing in place, or they also have laws, policies, local ordinances that stop the passage of further non-discrimination law. Okay, so that's still, again, those 51% of LGBT Americans living in states with hostile policies or complete lack of protection when it comes to conversion therapy, when it comes to employment, when it comes to housing, when it comes to public accommodation, when it comes to adoption and family building, right? Some folks are still trying to apply for marriage certificates and being turned away because regardless of the fact that it's actually been decided by the Supreme Court, right? People at local government levels want to fight back on that. I also want to just kind of show this stark difference here, okay? So we look at this one right here in the middle is our sexual orientation equality tally, okay? So it's not great, right? These darker colors are places where it's not super great, all right? That's just for sexual orientation. This is the map for gender identity policy. All the red is where it's not safe at all. Very unsafe to be a transgender American. That's a lot of states, okay? A lot of states. Luckily, we live in New York. New York's doing really well, actually. A lot of the progress that's been made around gender identity has come in just the last few years, okay? We actually still to this day do not have a state law in place protecting transgender New Yorkers. Nothing actually written down by our state Senate. We passed the Sexual Orientation Non-Discrimination Act in 2003. That got pushed through. You are protected by state law based on your sexual orientation. You cannot be fired. You cannot be denied housing. You cannot be denied public accommodation based on your orientation and or relationship dynamic at the time. We have nothing concrete when it comes to gender identity or gender expression. Yes, absolutely. So There has been a bill that has gone through the Assembly in New York 8 years in a row and has never seen the Senate floor, ever. It has died in committee every year, and it is called the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act, or GENDA for short. In essentially, I think, a fit of frustration with the Senate, Governor Cuomo 2 years ago issued an executive order that said, trans New Yorkers are protected. I'm basically tired of waiting for this law to be enacted, which is great, right? Really well done that we have those protections at this point, but it's an executive order, which means that it can be undone in a minute. The second another governor steps in and says, I don't really like this anymore. Right? So there's a precarious nature to a lot of this at this point when it comes to New York. However, when it comes to sexual orientation policies of any that could exist at all, we have 16 out of 19 in place, fully in place. It's pretty good. When it comes to gender identity policies in total, we're looking at 11 and a bit out of 18. Again, so much better than most of the other states in this country. Right? We're looking at folks within the trans community have coverage for medical insurance. Right? You can't be denied coverage based on your identity as a trans person in New York, whether that's private or public when it comes to Medicaid or things like that. You cannot be denied public accommodation. You cannot be denied housing. You cannot be denied employment. But again, that only just came on in the last couple of years. I actually identify as transgender, and when I was going to college, I went to Nazareth. It's in Pittsford, right? So the city of Rochester's had an ordinance in place since like 2000. It was one of the first cities in the whole country to put a non-discrimination ordinance in place for transgender individuals. It said, as long as you're in the city of Rochester, you are safe. You are safe for public accommodation, you are safe for employment, you are safe for housing. All of these things are guaranteed to you because you are a human being. But it's just for the city of Rochester. Now, I went to school in Pittsford, and so one of the fun facts I used to like to give people was I could, if someone wanted to, get fired in Pittsford because they just didn't like me, and they didn't like that I was trans. I'm protected in Rochester, I'm not protected in Pittsford. And that was just a couple of years ago. So our executive order that is in place right now protects everybody in the state of New York, but it's just an executive order, right? It's the larger legal ordinances, it's the larger legal policy that actually protects people in the long run. And that's why we're still in a very precarious situation in New York, because if Governor Cuomo decides not to run again, or he decides to step down for any reason, or he loses a re-election for any number of reasons, right? And someone steps in and they say no, then it's gone, okay? It's a great question. That's a great question. And a good time to kind of say that, yeah, lots of folks don't know that this is possible in our state, right? Lots of folks are kind of sitting around saying, hey, well, we got marriage equality, and, the state's been pretty good about stuff, so what's next? Folks not recognizing that, the protections for the trans people in their lives are basically contingent on who is sitting in the governor's office. And it shouldn't be like that, right? It should be encoded in our state law, just like everybody else's, that says this population of people have the right to housing, employment, walk through the street without fear of violence, right? That the murder rate should not be, for black trans women, 1 in 2,500, right? Should be 1 in 19,000, just like everybody else. We'll all have a fair shake of it, I guess. You don't have to get special treatment. You just, up with everyone else. So I absolutely agree that, it's a matter of talking about these things, right? It's a matter of making our elected officials aware of these issues, making them think that this is an important thing for them to talk about, and that this will affect the entire state, not just whatever percentage of people they think identify as trans. It really is about the betterment of our entire state to have something like that pushed through. It is really important policy. It's an important bill, and it's passed with bipartisan support with flying colors 8 years in a row in the New York Assembly, and it's just never seen the Senate floor. So thank your Assembly person if they have voted yes on it. If they haven't, ask them why. That might be something to do, just to get them involved in the conversation. But also nudging some of our elected officials in the Senate to think about these things, because they have just started their spring term, and these are the things that could get on the floor for them. So before I do kind of jump into more questions, because I want to give folks that opportunity to share. I just want to kind of leave us with this last piece here. Again, those really dark, almost red-brown states are the ones where there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing protecting somebody simply because of who they are. And it's 2018. Right? We are very fortunate to live in the state we're in, even if there are some tenuous aspects to our protections here. But when it comes to transgender individuals, especially those who don't fit neatly into a box, I fit very neatly back into a box. Right? I walk throughout the world without anybody knowing who I am unless I say something. The vast majority of people in my community do not have that opportunity. They can't just walk on in and have nobody know who they are. Right? They are visible all the time. And if they're visible, then they are targets. And if we don't have things in place to help to protect people from the discrimination that they face, then we're really failing an entire community of people. And that's where we see those horrific statistics coming from. So just kind of keeping that in mind as we move forward. So I will take some time here for questions. I'll let Susan very obviously turn off the live stream. Thank you everyone for listening there. And I do want to spend a little time here with you folks answering questions that you might have around anything that I brought up or something else that you came in with as well. All questions are okay here, regardless of the level of vocabulary or language, or whether you think it's really personal or not. Please feel free.